So it's almost like we're all sitting around having tea in the library here in my house or wherever you are. And so I hope it has a little bit of that kind of personal and more relaxed atmosphere to it as well. And so also for my talk, because I've been teaching a lot online in the last year, and I'm a little more used to kind of a classroom format for this online mode, you are welcome to put questions in the chat as I'm going through the talk. And if I get to a good breaking point, I will try to respond to those as I'm going through. So if something comes up where there's just something that you could use some clarification, I'm happy to engage with that as it comes along. Again, I've just been doing this a lot, so that's what I'm used to. That's the mode, this online mode. Actually, my last classes for this summer semester finished on Friday, so we've been doing quite a lot. So what I'll be talking about today is contemplative practice in what we call the classical period of China. And for this, I'll be talking a lot about what we call the master-disciple, really teacher-student lineages, which is a transmission from one teacher to a student, and seeing that as the most basic block of looking at affiliation and looking at community. And so with that in mind, I also really do want to bring up that, in a sense, this talk is an extension of my own affiliation within a teacher-student lineages, because I'll be talking a lot about my own teacher's work. And so this is the work of Dr. Harold Roth at Brown University, who's my teacher for many, many years and still my boss, and is a very, very good friend of mine. And this is really, we're going to be covering a lot of his research. His name has come up a number of times before this, but he's the one who kind of did the groundbreaking research. And so since we are in my library, I'm going to kind of push his books a little bit. A lot of it is in the initial book that he did is this one, Original Tao, where he did a translation of the Neye, inward training, where he identifies what he sees as the oldest text that contains contemplative practices in it, in the Daoist tradition. And so that's the original one that he did in the late 90s, and really kind of acts as the foundation for his model. And then the other one I want to promote, this just came out. This is his book on classical Daoism, which is a collection of a lot of articles. As you can see, it's quite thick. It just came out from SUNY Press. I helped him with some editing on this. So, and this contains kind of his complete vision of this model of classical Daoism based around practice. So if you're interested in reading more and reading a lot of stuff in depth, you can look at that. He has, and what he trained me in is a lot of, we could say, close textual reading. So looking at the history of the texts, looking at where they fit within other texts and other interactions. And so situating the practices within that larger historical, social, community-based context. And that's kind of where I'm going to be coming from in my talk today. So I'm just going to start sharing the screen now that I've shown off the books, and we'll see if this works. So I will pull this up and we will start the slideshow. So again, we're going to be talking about the contemplative practice in classical China, but I'm going to be starting with a little bit of contextualization for it, and so that we know kind of where these practices came, where they were situated, because they didn't develop in a void. They were in response to other things. And that can explain a little bit some of the difficulties that we've had in modern scholarship, and also going back many, many centuries, in trying to situate these texts, right? What does it mean to call them Daoism? Can we actually call them Daoist? Was there Daoism at this time? This is one of the hottest debates within. It's the sort of thing that, kidding, not kidding, people in actual conferences joke that they have to, they're never going to settle it intellectually, so they may as well put on boxing gloves and take it to the ring to get some sort of resolution. So we'll touch a little bit on that, because I think it's very important to recognize that this is kind of a contentious issue, but that also says a little bit more about the value of finding the practice itself within this larger context. So I'm going to start by defining what is classical China, because frankly, classical China is not one of the traditional historical blocks. So for the purpose of this talk, it's going to cover roughly 3 periods, which are the Warring States. And these are the traditional dates. So traditionally, the Warring States begins with the death of Confucius of Kongzi in about 475 BCE and runs to the founding of the Qin Empire in 221. Then we cover the Qin, which lasted only a little bit longer than the lifetime of its founder, until 206. And then really only the very beginning of this period, the beginning of the Han Dynasty, the Western Han. So that the Western Han ran all the way through to the 9th year of the Common Era. But really we're only talking about basically the first 2/3 of the 2nd century BCE in this classical China period. Now, why are we looking at these 3 periods in particular? Well, because the Warring States was sort of this era of an incredible flourishing of ideas, where you see a lot of production of writing and of the consolidation of oral traditions into textual formats goes on throughout this entire period, sort of in response to the times, which, as the name would suggest, there were all of these different smaller states which had formerly been part of a larger, more consolidated, not really an empire at that time, but a sense of a sort of consolidated alignment of these different communities, which we call the Joe Dynasty. And they had fractured by this point. So a lot of people were basically going around saying, how do we fix this? What do we need to go to bring things back together into that original harmony? The solution to that sort of was the Qin, who essentially unified everyone through violence and through authoritarian politics. But that didn't last very long. It collapsed. And a lot of the criticism of it was that authoritarianism was actually what brought about its rapid downfall. So even though it was pragmatic in the short term, in the long term, it wasn't something you could build an actual surviving and thriving community out of. So the early Western Han is especially important because it's the period where people were looking back over these past periods and saying, what did we really do? What happened? What were people thinking about? And they were trying to consolidate those ideas. And so this is when we see a lot of the texts that started forming in the Warring States were edited and revised and recompiled during this time into the versions that we know now. And this also was the period in time where we see a lot of standardization of different sort of theories and systems of thought, and where we see the early definitions of things like Daoism and Confucianism. This is where we start seeing that. So the early Han is really the lens through which we see the earlier history. So in some sense, we're never really seeing the Warring States for what it is, where we're seeing the Han version of the Warring States. And that itself, of course, is coming through its own filters of history. It's also important to recognize that by the time people are writing in the early Han, from their conception, there was about as much history preceding them, going back to the mythical era of the sagely founders of Chinese civilization, as there is between us and them. And this is something I think that we oftentimes forget about when we're looking this far back in the past. We think that almost, it's hard for us to think there were things before that. But in their mind, Chinese civilization had been around for almost 2,000 years before this. And these are, of course, the dates that I'm giving here are these traditional dates by this bibliographer, Liu Xin. And so they're not really, these are mythical periods, so we shouldn't see them as being absolute, right? So we have some archaeological evidence, but that only begins really arguably for the Xia Dynasty, the 2nd period. So in the traditional narrative of Chinese history is you have this mythical era with these sagely founders, people like Fuxi, or Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who we'll talk about a little bit more in this talk. And they kind of developed civilization. They founded it. And then at the end of this period, you see the start of the Xia Dynasty with the great Yu the Great. And he's famous for the flood myth in China. Instead of building a boat, he organizes everybody to dredge canals. And so they, through public works, they defeat the floods in that way. And he founds the Xia Dynasty. And then you see this narrative in Chinese history where each dynasty, later on this is more codified in this principle that they call the mandate of heaven, that the beginning of the dynasty is founded by somebody who's this very virtuous person. And that over a period of time, as they transmit the dynasty down to as their inheritors, their children and grandchildren inherit it, that virtue gets diluted until eventually you get someone who's corrupt at the end of the dynasty. The mandate of heaven is lost. That's a sign that it's gone. And so a new dynasty has to take over. So the Xia eventually declines, the Shang Dynasty comes in. And the Shang is where we get the first real archaeological records and the first written records. They had this interesting practice of they would take bones, they would take the plastrons, the frontispieces of tortoises, or the scapula, the shoulder blades of oxen, and they would use them in these divination rituals where they would ask the ancestors for advice on what was going to happen in the future, or on different medical situations that were going on. The ancestors were actually thought to possibly be involved in, there was one king who was divining a lot about his toothache, for example, and whether an ancestor was causing them. And this is all written down on these bones, and so they represent kind of our earliest version of our earliest writing from Chinese history. And they also represent, in a weird way, kind of the earliest history, because some of them also include not only what was being divined on and the recommendations that the ancestors give, the advice that they give, the future that they tell, but then they also give a follow-up where they say whether something actually happened or not. So in a way, they represent the origins of history. The Zhou Dynasty is the one that follows that, and this is where we start seeing most of our real kind of archaeological evidence. If you go and you see these sort of bronze cauldrons and tripods and drinking vessels and so forth in a lot of museums, this is the period where that really starts happening. The Zhou Dynasty, we call it a dynasty, but keep in mind none of these are really functioning in the kind of imperial bureaucratic way that we see in all of the subsequent dynasties from the Qin through the Han and onward. These were really much more kind of loosely family organized. Somewhat, we use the term feudalism, but it's really kind of an approximation of what was going on. But they were really kind of organized around family ties. And the Zhou Dynasty is, if you accept the dates, the longest period of time in Chinese history of almost 2,000 years, almost 1,000 years. And it's actually broken up into a number of different periods. We're most interested in the last two, the spring and autumn period, which basically lasts until the death of Confucius in 476, 475, and then the Warring States period, which we've already mentioned up until this time. Now, these are particularly important to keep in mind because each of these had their own traditions. And so by the time you get to the Zhou Dynasty, there was already a very well-established ritual tradition with its own established set of moral values, which became very prominent when you look at the recorded sayings of Kongzi, of Confucius, in the Analects. He keeps talking about how important these Zhou Dynasty rituals were. That was actually, that tradition was, he saw the foundations of Chinese society and civilization. So these rituals, and we could say, the texts that went along with them, we wouldn't call them scriptures, but we would usually, when we translate the term jing in reference to these texts, we call them classics, because they're not seen in the, although they have some of the same sort of religious significance at this time. Those scriptures were in existence. There's a kind of sense of ethics and morality that's already in place, and there's a ritual tradition that's already in place. And this is something that these early Taoist texts are responding to and evolving out of, developing out of. So it's not as though they're in a void. They're already in this elaborate ritual context. And it was in the Warring States that we start seeing the development of what for years people have called schools of thought. And I'll get to in a moment why this is in quotes. This is one of these hotly debated topics in scholarly circles. We already started mentioning a so-called Confucianism, what in the initial description of the schools is called the Rujia, the family of the Ru, which it can more properly be translated as literati or classicists, because they were most interested in studying the classics, and in particular in studying these inherited traditions, these rituals that had been passed down as they saw it from the founders of the Zhou Dynasty down to them, and that represented in the mind of Kongzi, of Confucius, the most perfect patterns of human interaction that you could have. So he keeps going back to them and saying, we need to revitalize these if we want to solve this problem of the warring states. People are fighting each other, not because these traditions were imperfect, but because people weren't correctly or properly representing them in the current time. And they had their own sort of sets of ethics. The most important one of these is this concept of ren, humaneness, which is really not so much a moral principle as more kind of a feeling of interrelatedness. The character, if you look at it etymologically, this is kind of visual etymology. The two lines on the left are a person radical, and the two lines on the right, or the two horizontal lines on the right, are the number 2. So some people gloss this as, in fact, two-personness. It's a sense of desiring the well-being and the flourishing of other people, and the idea that it's impossible to have well-being on one's own. You cannot flourish as an individual. You have to see to it that everyone in the society around you is doing well if you yourself want to do well. And this idea, this feeling, this way of relating to people was something that didn't necessarily come about just naturally and spontaneously, but it had to be cultivated through the consistent practice of these traditions, this ritual. And in fact, Robert Eno, a modern scholar, has written quite a bit about how if we look at this early period of Confucian thinking, even though later it becomes so characterized by textual study, What was most important to these early people was their practice of ritual, the way that they embodied these traditions in themselves, and that characterized them more than necessarily their text study. And so, as I mentioned, this is said to begin with Kongzi, with Confucius. Now, the other one for our interest today is Daoism, which again, in the earliest definitions, and this is a Han Dynasty definition, is called Daojia, the family of the Tao. And they were said to value following and or merging with the Tao, which we were talking about this yesterday, is kind of imperfectly translated as the way. Now, it's worth noting, some scholars point out that a lot of traditions at this time talked about Tao, that talked about a way of being. And so the Confucians talk a lot about a way of being in the world with other people. But what these Daoists start talking about that's a little different is they see their Tao, as they talk about it, is something that doesn't just end with the limits of human interaction or behavior, but it's something that is more cosmic. It embraces things beyond human society and has to do with the foundations of the cosmos as well as its later manifestations. The Tao is something that is both transcendent and immanent. In other words, that it's not something that is the world. It cannot be wholly defined by things that are in the world, but it also cannot be said to be separate from the world.
Larson,
it's present in everything. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Your PowerPoint's not moving. So I don't know if you're actually moving through slides because
I'm not moving through slides. No.
Okay, I just want to check because people are confused. So
you're welcome. Oh, is there chat going on? I'm not seeing a chat.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
So, so no, I'm not going through that. I'm just talking a little bit and if I'm speaking very vaguely and abstractly about this, it's because it's very difficult to talk about the Tao at all. As they say, it's difficult to say anything in particular about it. And so we'll just leave it at that, with it being somewhat undefinable. And it's said to begin with Lao Tzu, who, the traditional story has it that Lao Tzu was the teacher of Confucius, but there's a lot of debate about whether he existed at all. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here. I have to make sure I'm clicking on things. There were other schools of thought at this time too. I'll just cover on them, touch them briefly. These are some more of the ones that were defined in the Han, the Moists, who were probably the most organized and most school-like of the different schools. They didn't really survive past the Warring States period. There were also we call the school of names, the Mingjia, sometimes the logicians. They were more interested in logic and discussion. And the legalists, who were interested in rule by law and using rewards and punishments. They're the ones who get kind of the brunt of the criticism for both inspiring the Qin in its rise to power, giving it the tools to rise to power, and then also ultimately...
Hey, Larson?
Yes?
I'm really sorry to interrupt you again. I think you are sharing not the screen that we are seeing, because we're just seeing your PowerPoint without the slides being shown.
What do you mean?
You're not sharing the show.
I'm not sharing the show.
We're just seeing your PowerPoint, like with the list of slides to the left and the first slide in the middle.
Oh.
And they're not advancing.
So are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay. So have you seen these slides? Have you seen this one?
No.
And this one?
No.
Oh, okay. So you've just seen this slide?
Yes.
Oh, all right. So this was the first slide. Thank you for telling me. I don't know why it does that. All right. So this was when I was talking about the different periods. This is the historical overview. I'm sorry. It would have made a lot more sense if you had seen these. So I was just talking about these schools of thought. Thank you for letting me know. Otherwise, we would have gone the whole time and it would have been quite confusing. All right. So this is where we were. I'm about to transition now to the next one. So this is where we're getting to the point where we're kind of giving the modern historian's critique of this time period, and why it's important to understand these through this lens of why we're seeing them through the lens of the Han Dynasty. So basically, these different schools are actually 6 schools. There's also a school of yin and yang that was interested in cosmology. We call them cosmologists, the way that the universe was put together. That together they make up what are called the 6 schools, which were in this essay that was written by the Sima Tan, who started writing the Shiji, the records of the grand historian, which were then completed by his son, Sima Qian, who's a little bit more famous. But essentially, he is looking back in time and trying to, as I was saying, to sort out, well, what is this lineage of this inheritance that we have gotten from the Warring States period, this intellectual and practical and traditional inheritance? How do we understand them? And so this essay on the six schools is kind of one of really the first time we see this clear definition into, let's try to organize these different thinkers, these different texts as they were starting to come together into these groupings that allowed people to better understand them. Now, some of this, if we want to be, give a more positive or generous sort of reading of it, was as a way of just understanding what they had done, as I was saying. But the more critical version is that these affiliations were really closely tied to the politics that were going on in the Han court at the time, because some of the legitimacy that the Han court, the imperial court, was trying to pull together came from the way that they were processing and using these earlier ideas. So as I was just mentioning, the legalists, for example, were associated with recommending harsh punishments, and were also associated with the rise to power of the Shang Dynasty, which in turn was thought of as being authoritarian and overly extreme. And so people didn't want to be associated with that, right? The new emperors didn't want to continue that association, even if they wanted to use some of the tools that the legalists were recommending, people like Han Feizi. So these kind of definitions allowed them to start to speak in terms that were a little bit more useful to them. As far as we know, there is no solid proof that the affiliations were clearly defined in this same way during the Warring States period. So for example, the Confucians, it seems like each of Kongzi's own disciples had their own sublineages, and that each of those had their own slightly different variations of how they handled his teachings. And likely different groups of Confucians and others even had their own sort of textual traditions, even if it was still kind of an oral tradition at the time. As they were starting to write things down, they would pass it down in these master-disciple lineages from one generation to the next. And we shouldn't really think of them as these big sort of monolithic blocks that were interacting with each other. It wasn't like there was the Daoist club where in one version of the mythological story, Lao Tzu directly taught Zhuangzi and then these other two Daoists at the time, Liezi and Wenzi, and that they were all like hanging out in the Daoist club and saying, we're Daoists, and had a big sign on the door. It wasn't like that at all, as far as we can tell. But what this also means is, another thing that's really important about this is that there's some ideas that seem to go cross texts. So there's some things that seem to appear in texts that would be labeled as Confucian or legalist that seem to resonate with things in Daoist texts, or for goodness sakes, militarist texts like the Sun Tzu Bingfa, Sun Tzu's Art of War. And there's these connections that might be overlooked or that become problematic if we're too rigidly attached to these school affiliations. So I'm also going to, as an additional note to this, we're going to talk about the texts themselves are problematic in other ways at this time. As I say with my students, that there's a lot of difficulties in dating texts, like, where do you take them out for dinner? What kinds of food would a text like? Or do you buy them roses? Or anyway. Some students laugh at that. I see some people are smiling. Most people don't. Anyway, the issue with the Warring States texts is that most of them, coming from the Warring States period, were multivocal texts written by multiple authors. In fact, some of them we can even identify strata, like different layers. So if you're familiar with geology and you look at core samples where you dig down, you can see these different layers of earth built on top of each other. A lot of the texts at this time, you can actually discover that, and there's a whole field of study where people go in and actually try to analyze these different strata. Then on top of that, there were multiple compilers over time. So people came together at different times and tried to restructure the texts. So the Zhuangzi, for example, not only had people who were compiling it into the early Han Dynasty, but you also have people, the most famous commentator on it, Guoxiang, who was writing in the early centuries of the Common Era, actually went through and edited it down from 52 chapters to 33 chapters. So he played a very substantial role in defining how we read the text now. So this is to keep in mind that we're not really reading the things that people in the Warring States would have been writing, of the people who were writing things when they were actually writing them down, because that's the other thing. Most of them, or a lot of them, were compiled from other pre-existing sources, including oral traditions. So this is really important in the case of the Lao Tzu, the Daode Jing. We talked about this previously. It's also important for things like the Lunyu, the Analects of Confucius, and many other texts at the time. On top of this, there's other texts which we consider to be weishu, forged texts. So two other texts which are thought to be from this period that are associated with the Daoist tradition, the Wenzi and the Liezi, as far as we can tell, and this is something people have known about for centuries and have been writing about, were likely recompiled at a later time, so much so that if there was a text of the same name at this earlier period, they don't really resemble that earlier text. And we can get into some of that if you were interested, but let's just leave it as that there's a lot of complexity to these texts. The other thing about this too is, and I brought this up a bit, is that there were common ideas. The Han is this lens through which we're reading these earlier periods. So a lot of ideas we might associate with Daoism were actually things that were held in common with a number of different groups. We're kind of a common philosophical cosmological structure at the time. We talked a little bit about the I Ching yesterday. The I Ching is actually one of the texts that becomes one of the 5 so-called Confucian classics. It becomes canonized in the 2nd century BCE as one of these central repositories of earlier knowledge that the Ru, the literati, the classicists were really interested in studying and conveying further. It was something that existed before the Warring States period, and its ideas came to be foundational for a lot of the Han Dynasty cosmology that developed. So some of these ideas, they predate the Han, but they really come to cement ideas that developed during the Han Dynasty, became really solid during the Han Dynasty, of how the world works. So things like yin and yang, the 5 phases, the 8 trigrams. So many of you who are familiar with Chinese medicine or with feng shui or with other kinds of practices that make use of things, particularly like the 5 phases, or if you do Xing Yi Quan that has the 5 phases, or Baguazhang, which uses the 8 trigrams, these were things that, even though Daoists use them a lot, they're not something that is foundationally Daoist. They're something that's really, we should see as being a component of Chinese culture as a whole. So this is kind of the environment that these texts are sort of emerging out of. And we see this also with the exemplary figures of the time. We mentioned some of the sage kings, people like Fu Xi, who was thought to have developed the original technologies of civilization just from observing natural patterns. And in fact, the great commentary on the I Ching, the Dazhuan, also known as the Shi Zizhuan, the commentary and the attached sayings of it's a little difficult to translate that, of the I Ching, talks a lot about how these ancient sages observed nature and then they copied it down in the markings of the I Ching. And then from that, later generations can use those textual patterns. So through using a textual hermeneutic, they can indirectly interpret natural patterns themselves. So that's where these different systems come into play. And for our purposes, the most important of these is Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who we see coming up a lot in different stories. So he's attributed with all kinds of things. And he appears in a number of different stories where he's very involved in aspects of self-cultivation, and in particular with the application of self-cultivation, even medical ideas, to rulership, to how to rule and govern a state. Let's talk a little bit about Daoism in particular, though, because there's Daoism, I think, even more than the other traditions that are supposed to be labeled as schools at this time, has come under a lot of critique. We mentioned some of this. There's this big question: did it exist at all? Should we consider it to be Daoism? And what does it mean when we're talking about that? So, although originally the very earliest scholars of Daoist studies, so this is going back to the early part of the 20th century and before, put maybe too much emphasis on the texts of the Laozi and the Zhuangzi as being this kind of philosophical, more original, more sort of pure intellectual form of Daoism that later was, in their mind, tainted by the superstitious elements of later transformations in the tradition. There was a reaction to that in the middle of the 20th century, starting most prominently with Michel Strickmann, who sort of changed the tone of the debate and made this rather striking claim at the time that, in fact, Daoism began with the celestial masters, the Tianshu Dao, and that everything before that should not really be considered as Daoism, but rather as these kind of literati interactions, and that the texts themselves, yes, they're used by later Daoists and are very important for later Daoists, but are not themselves inherently Daoist. So in this mind, it's similar to the way that things like the 5 phases we were just looking at are not actually Daoist, even though they're used by Daoists. We'll come back to that a little bit as we're discussing this. But in this model, Daoism is defined by institutions, and so you have to qualify as a Daoist, you have to be clearly ordained as in a lineage where you can trace back your connection to, in particular, the celestial masters and these kinds of structures that they develop. There's also been a number of historians from the Han Dynasty and earlier who again have gone to this issue that we don't really have proof of organized groups in the Warring States. And so in their critique, they see that Daoism is even less distinct than many of the other groups, like the Confucians. At least they could trace a lineage back to Zhuangzi himself, right? They had people who supposedly studied with other people and so forth. But the Daoists, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, especially when a lot of modern scholars now believe that Lao Tzu was not an actual historical figure, but was a later myth that was created to represent the author of the Lao Tzu, the Daode Jing. And so in that model, well, what kind of organization does this text have? And they also point to there's a number of contradictions in the ideas of the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi, that there are certain places where they don't seem to quite match up to each other and not represent a coherent block of thinking, even though there are places where they also overlap. But in the minds of these historians, there are more contradictions than there are similarities. And there's also been a lot of critique of different sort of messy definitions of Daoism at this time. I mentioned the philosophical versus religious issue. That all of these we've really been trying to kind of problematize and question in our more recent scholarship. So especially in the last 20 years, there's been a big push to get past this division between philosophical and religious Daoism. Actually, Dr. Kamiathi Lewis's work is one of the more prominent projects in looking at ways of connecting and getting rid of this kind of artificial division that we've put in place. There's some others. Another one that was really popular for a long time was Lao Zhuang Daoism, which is the combination of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, seeing them as this kind of, that's Daoism, that's a more pure form of Daoism. That is also probably an artificial definition by later people, not quite as late as the philosophical versus religious one, but it's not contemporaneous. And then the last one, the most complicated one, is this version of Huang Lao, Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who we were just talking about with Lao Tzu. And this seems to be a version of Daoism that was particularly prominent, starts appearing in biographies of people in the Shiji. And it seems to refer to a type of Daoism that was interested in political applications, particularly in the rulership of an empire. And there's a lot of questions about whether or not that's actually was a real category or something, again, that was retroactively applied to different thinkers, partially because it seems to have been very, very broadly applied. And some of the people who are listed as being Huang Lao in their biographies were actually affiliated with, for example, the legalist school. So this is the background into which my teacher, Harold Roth, Dr. Harold Roth, brings his analysis, and where he offers a solution to try to say how we can meaningfully talk about a Daoism in this classical period. And his essential innovation was to look at the tradition not as defined by texts or ideas, but the practices of which we see evidence in the texts themselves. So he's not drawing them out of thin air, but he's finding evidence in the text that shows that people were doing practices that connected them or tied them together. And he uses this as a way of trying to understand how the textual evidence that we have actually fit together. And the key block to this, again, is that idea of the master-disciple practice lineages, that you would have a teacher who would have a set of practices and oral sayings, and perhaps also some kind of textual tradition that they had, a text that they were transmitting, they would give to their disciples along with the practice. But the practice was the core part, and everything else was kind of explaining or going along with the practices that sort of defined their lineage and their connection. I mentioned Robert Eno, who also has brought up a similar idea with the Confucians, saying that really we should think of them as having a ritual practice, and that being the defining way of looking at Confucians rather than some kind of abstract theoretical way of tying them together. So because of this, Roth is able to bring together more texts under the Daoist umbrella than would traditionally be listed there. So the foundational ones, most importantly, the one that he did that green and blue book, Original Dao, on, was this text, Neya, which he translates as inward training, along with these two other chapters, Shinshu, which can be translated as the techniques of the heart-mind, which appear in this larger collection, the Guanzi, which was sometimes classified as the legalist text, sometimes thought as this kind of miscellaneous or a text of a variety of different things brought together into one place. And so he's able to draw those chapters out and see them as being foundational. Then Of course, we have the Laozi and the Zhuangzi, which are the really well-known ones. And then he's also able to add in the Lu Shi Chunqiu, which was a state-sponsored text during the Qin. And then these other texts that are associated with Huangdi, with the Yellow Emperor, that were excavated at Mawangdui and at Yinchueshan. There's been a lot of debate about these. There are in imperial library catalogs from the Han Dynasty these names of texts, these titles of texts that were associated with the Yellow Emperor, like the Huangdi Jing, the Four Canons of the Yellow Emperor. And nobody had them. They hadn't survived past the Han Dynasty. In fact, by some estimates, close to 90% of the titles that were in these library catalogs are no longer extant. And so when people dug these things up out of tombs and found these physical manuscripts, there was a certain excitement and an eagerness to say, oh, these must be the lost Four Canons of the Yellow Emperor. And there's been a lot of scholarly debate about whether they fit or not in that model. But anyway, some of the things that are contained in them, whether they actually are the Huangdi Jing or not, do seem to have some overlap. And then lastly, and most importantly, the Huainanzi, which was, again, kind of a state-sponsored text sponsored by this, we call him a king. So if you think about feudal definitions, the emperor has kings underneath the emperor who are answer to the emperor. So the king of the state of Huainan, which was during the Han Dynasty, Liu An sponsored the creation of this text, the Huainanzi, which contains in it recommendations on how to rule from, as Professor Roth classifies it, a fundamentally classical Daoist perspective grounded in these kinds of practices. So what are the practices? I know I've been leading up to this a lot. And part of this is because when we say the practices, so, you know, in the Jing Jing, right, it says the scripture of clarity and stillness is this whole thing that you go through this long process of many stages of practice, and then at the end it says, you know, and gradually at the end of this, finally you get to the point where you can do a Dao, you can attain the Dao, but then you realize that there's nothing to attain. So in some ways, I think that there's something like that going on here. We get to the end of it and you say, so what were they doing? They were doing nothing, right? That's what they were doing. They were actually doing nothing. Their core practice appears to be what Roth calls an apophatic meditation. So apophatic means emptying out the contents of consciousness in this context. It's a process of negation, of emptying. And that they would actually go through, and he sees in the texts a whole set of, by looking at certain types of technical terminology that are shared between the texts, among the texts, and looking at the sequence in which those technical terms are deployed, he sees that there's this whole process that begins with aligning the body, this term jing, which actually is usually translated as correcting or rectifying, but he translates specifically as aligning, which when you think about it, if you've ever tried to sit and think about breathing very deeply, you realize that if you're not sitting correctly, so to speak, it's a lot harder to actually breathe comfortably. So this kind of alignment is a way of rectifying, aligning the body. And then by stilling the body, then the mind gradually also becomes very still. The attention is focused. It's not allowed to go chasing after all kinds of things. And through this process, it gradually leads into these states of tranquility, of jing, and then emptiness, of shu. And importantly, this is not just something that one enjoys in the short term, but it has a lot of resultant traits. So you may have this tranquil state, but it leads to these resultant traits that are visible outside of the actual practicing itself, including physical signs of improved health. Things like in the Neya, it talks about improved skin quality and things like that. But then also perceptiveness, so an ability to see things, sometimes even to see things before they happen. So you remember that going all the way back to the Shang, people were really interested in this idea of predicting events before they happened. And there seems to be, even if it's not exactly predicting them in the future, it's being able to see things. So one text, there's a story about the kind of the founder of the Joe Dynasty, King Wen. He didn't actually, his son was the one who led the war that actually began the Joe Dynasty, but he's the one who supposedly realized that the Shang was falling apart and prepared for it. He goes to the court of the last king of the Shang, who is, of course, now a tyrant based on these narratives, these dynastic narratives. But the last king of the Shang has not yet become a full tyrant, right? So King Wen goes there and he's invited this feast, and he notices that there are ivory chopsticks at the meal. And afterwards he leaves and he's very, very worried, and he's telling his retainers, he says, oh, we've got to start preparing for war. And they said, what do you mean? You just had dinner. That was a nice dinner. What do you mean? And he says, well, you saw there were ivory chopsticks. And if he has ivory chopsticks, that means now he's going to need to have golden plates to go along with them. And you can't just have nice looking silverware, dinnerware. You need to have good food to go along with it. So now that means you have to have all of these other structures that are going to build up to that, just to answer to the king's need for luxury. And so he says, this means that he's going to become a tyrant. And so sure enough, in this narrative, he becomes a tyrant. And because King Wen was the only one who is perceptive enough to see this, he's the only one who's prepared and is able to leave the foundation so his son can lead this revolution and establish this more virtuous Zhou Dynasty. So that's this kind of perceptiveness, right? It's an awareness of what's going on that's developed in these texts that are talking about apathetic meditation through this stillness practice, and combined with that, a kind of responsiveness. So when we hear a lot of talk about xiaoyaoyou, free and easy wandering in Zhuangzi, or wu wei, non-action in Laozi, or following ziran, that what is so of itself, this can be read or understood as a kind of spontaneity that is arising out of this point of stillness, this emptying out of all of the kind of conceptual constructs that we have, the kind of social conditioning that we have that shapes us into acting only in certain ways, and opens the door for this kind of, again, almost ability to tell the future, almost divinatory perceptiveness of the future, and combined with it, reducing that kind of inertia that we have. You know, there are those situations where we're sort of thinking, oh, I can see this is going to be a problem and I really ought to do it, but we start procrastinating on it and we're not able to actually fulfill it. And so the thought is that these apophatic practices are able to prepare one to both see and to be able to act on them. And although the earliest ones seem most interested in, like Neya, seem most interested in on a personal level, by the time you get to something like the Huainanzi, they're applying this to the ruler and the activities of the ruler. So the idea is, yeah, this is great in one's personal life, but just think if the emperor were able to do this, if the emperor were able to see there's going to be a revolution, there's going to be a war before it happens, or there's going to be a famine before it happens, and then being able to immediately and spontaneously prepare for that action. That seems like a pretty good way for the ruler to act. And so that becomes sort of the thesis of the Huainanzi in this reading, right? This is the central way that the ruler is supposed to work. So I'll give some examples. A lot of what I have after this is textual examples, because I think it's nice to go back to the texts themselves and see that work and see the evidence for these contained in the written texts. And this also gives us an opportunity to talk about things. So either now or when we're going back, if there's something you want to look at in these texts, we can pull up the slides again and go back to a particular one to talk about a little bit more. And as I was looking at it this morning, I realized there's a lot of people who read the original Chinese, and so I probably should have put that in here. But this was originally stuff I was doing for my students, so I just left it with the translation. So my apologies to all of you who are able to read it. It would have been nice to do that. That's my failing in putting this together. But so, for example, these are some of the passages that Roth sees as being particularly important. So the way, the Tao, has no fixed position. It abides within the excellent mind. When the mind is tranquil and the vital energy, the qi, is regular, it's patterned, the Tao can thereby be halted. That Tao is not distant from us. When people attain it, they are sustained. That Tao is not separated from us. When people accord with it, they are harmonious. Therefore, concentrate. This is that idea of concentration again. And concentration not necessarily being like effort, although there's a little bit of that. It's more like being focused on something, of condensing into something, of bringing something together. Concentrated, as if you could be roped together with it. Interestingly, in some Buddhist texts on shamatha meditation practice, they talk about the first stage being like taking flakes of soap and gathering them together in a ball. And I think there's a little bit of that here, this idea of roping it together, tying it together, rather than, we think about concentration as, oh, I'm going to put in a lot of effort and really concentrate on this. It's binding it together, gathering it together, that kind of concentration. Indiscernible, as if beyond all locations, the true state of that way. How could it be conceived of and not pronounced upon? Cultivate your mind, make your thoughts tranquil, and the way can thereby be grasped. So the Tao, which is in this model that thing to which people are looking to follow, to merge with, to be able to pattern their own lives after. This idea that if you can in some way to recognize the connection that we inherently have with the Tao, that it then leads to this kind of greater perceptiveness and spontaneity. This is something that's attained in this passage ultimately through making the thoughts tranquil. Right? This idea of patterning the qi, making the mind tranquil and still, of concentrating it. Another passage, I think that gets a little bit more into some of these details. There's a numinous mind, a Shen. Shen can literally be translated as a god or a spirit. So in this case, there's actually a god of sorts residing naturally within. It also means attention and awareness in other contexts of consciousness almost. One moment it goes, the next it comes, and no one is able to conceive of it. Right? So this is something later on, we also hear a lot of discussion about that the Shen is something that can flow out, right? You look at something, the Shen goes there, right? So you don't want to let it escape too much. It comes and goes, just like the thoughts can come and go as our attention goes to one thing and then the next. If you lose it, you're inevitably disordered. And there's a lot of descriptions of people in other texts who lose track of their Shen, and they become distracted and disoriented, and suddenly they're tripping over roots and smashing into branches. If you attain it, you are inevitably well-ordered. Diligently clean out its lodging place, and the vital essence, the jing, will naturally arrive. So it's interesting to note, these are some of the earliest instances that we see what later become known as the three treasures, jing, qi, and shen, the three internal treasures appearing within a text, even though they don't necessarily go together in the way that they later on go together in conceptions. They have some similarities, but we shouldn't necessarily be tied by the later definitions. But what thing I really want to point out here that's important is this idea of a lodging place, the shu. So the human body is itself a vessel, a dwelling place for these different elements, these components. And that activity, excessive activity of making it too full, makes it impossible to put something else in. So in the Lao Tzu, it talks about that the emptiness is what gives a drinking vessel its use, that a cup is able to hold liquid because it's empty. If it's already full of stuff, you can't put any liquid in it. So there seems to be some of that going on here as well. This idea that by emptying out the consciousness, by emptying out the person, you're able to provide this space for these other qualities to be able to lodge, to manifest, to become concentrated again, and to grow. This next one is from Shinshu, the first Shinshu, the Techniques of the Mind. This is actually not a published translation, so my thanks to Professor Roth who let me use this in my dissertation. So I'm quoting it here. It's a little bit adapted. The adaptations are mostly me bringing in and putting in the Chinese characters and the Chinese words in certain places. So he reads this, this is his translation of it. The Tao is located within the heavens and the earth. So vast there is nothing outside it, so minute there is nothing inside it. That idea of that it's something that we can't grasp, simultaneously transcendent and eminent, that even language, even the human mind is in some way unable to fully conceptualize of it. Therefore, the text says it is not distant, yet it is difficult to reach its limit. It's there, but we can't just immediately get to the full extent of it. It dwells together with human beings, something inherent to our experience. This means there's no gap between them. Only the sage is able to find this empty Tao. Therefore, the text says, it dwells together with human beings, yet is difficult to find. What the sage controls is jing, the vital essence. When you get rid of desires, you become expansive. When you are expansive, you become tranquil. When you are tranquil, then your jing will become concentrated. When it is concentrated, then your mind will attain complete solitude. When it attains complete solitude, it will be illumined. When it is illumined, then it will be Shen. So this is an example of those sequences, those chains of if one, then another, a Sordes chain of if there's one thing, then another thing will result from it. That Roth identifies as being characteristic of these apophatic descriptions. And so you can see this begins with getting rid of desires that then leads to these states of expansiveness, tranquility, and then interestingly brings this consolidation of the vital essence, which ultimately leads to illumination and the Shen, the numinous qualities, the perceptive qualities. Shen is the most honored one. Therefore, if the building is not cleaned out, then the honored one will not lodge there. Therefore, the text says, if it is not pure, then Shen will not dwell there. This idea of that actually indwelling sense of the Shen, of the spirit, Of course, later Taoist traditions make this much more explicit when they talk about actual gods that are visualized living in the body. But there's some of this sense even here, this idea of being able to lodge, or that the human body is, again, this vessel, that it's not impenetrable, that we are composed of a multitude. This also appears, he sees this also in, again, the more famous text, the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi. So this is an example of those in Lao Tzu 15. Of old, those who manifested the Tao were minutely subtle and profoundly pervasive. They were too deep to be known. Because they could not be known, we can only give a makeshift description. So again, they're kind of like the Tao in this case. It's very difficult to describe them or talk about them. They're manifesting it so well that they're approaching that level, so to speak. Tentative, as if fording a river in winter, cautious, as if in fear of neighbors, solemn like guests, melting like thawing ice, undifferentiated like the uncarved block, vast like a valley, murky like muddy water. So all of this, again, is going back to this idea of this primordial unity of something before it has been chopped up, before it has been divided, before the kinds of social conditioning we get, or the definitions, the distinctions we make in our lives start taking it apart and making it into smaller things. Now, this is that original vast emptiness that is full of potential. And then here is this really interesting line. When muddy water is made tranquil, it gradually becomes clear. When the calm is made active, it gradually springs to life. I have a friend who's actually a Rinzai Zen priest who begins a lot of his workshops. The Reverend Doctor is actually a Ph.D., Matsubara Masaki, who whenever he starts his talks, I've been to a lot of his retreats, and whenever he starts, he will inevitably get a bottle of water, and he'll go out and he'll get a bunch of dirt and he'll shovel it into the bottle. And you're always, when I first saw this, I'm like, what are you doing, right? Don't you want to drink that? You think he's asking because he's going to talk and he wants something to drink in the middle of the talk. Well, he shovels the dirt in there and he goes outside and he swirls it around and he brings it in and he says, this is what the mind looks like when it's active. And of course, it's this dirty water. And he says, so how do we make this clear? Well, you have to leave it alone. So you put it down in the middle of the room and then gradually it settles down. Right? And that dirt all settles to the bottom, and the water becomes clear and it's transparent, and you can see through it. Right? So this is a metaphor for that, a metaphor for this apophatic practice. Those who embrace this way, this Tao, do not wish to become full. It is only because they do not wish to become full that they can wear out and yet be newly made. So in this context, again, the great thing about the Lao Tzu is you can read it in so many different ways, and there's so many interpretations of it. Some of them, may be more legitimate than others, but it's wonderful that it's this multifaceted text. But if we want to look at it from a contemplative perspective, this idea of emptiness, you have to empty out the thoughts to give a potential space for other things to enter in. You can't see what's in front of you if you're too busy thinking about something else. You're losing that direct connection with reality. And this is also something we see in the Zhuangzi. Right? So here's another one from chapter 15 of Zhuangzi. Thus it is said, imperturbable calm, utter stillness, the empty absence of thoughts, having no activity. These are the neutral bases of heaven and earth, the very stuff of the way and inner power of De. Right? So Dao and De, the Daode Jing. Thus it is said, the sages find rest therein. When resting, they are completely relaxed. When completely relaxed, they are imperturbably calm. When completely relaxed and imperturbably calm, then anxieties and misfortunes cannot enter in, and the aberrant chi cannot seep in. So this is, again, also something that we can probably find, at least, I think is pretty relatable. If you're sitting still and you're calming down, all that normal activity of thinking about the schedule, when do I have to be here? Did I remember to answer that email? Did I talk to this person? In that last conversation I had, replaying it, did I insult somebody? We're going over these things again and again and again. That waking up in the middle of the night, if you suffer from insomnia, like I do sometimes, you're thinking about, all those things that I should have done, or maybe I didn't do the right way. All of that anxiety and that thinking about misfortunes, that keeps stirring things up, keeps everything murky and muddy. And so this quieting and calming down is able to enter into this state of clearness that, all of that anxiety makes it impossible to come up with a solution, right? So you think about the times when maybe we're thinking about something over and over again and we can't solve it, we can't think of an answer to it. And what we have to do is get away from the problem, go for a walk, sit down and be quiet, do something different, clear out the mind. And then all of a sudden the solution just naturally arises, or even in dreams sometimes. But it needs that space. It needs that potential vacuum for something new to enter in. If we're keeping it full, if we're keeping it murky, nothing can ever happen. Further on in the same chapter, in their living, they accord with the course of heaven. In their dying, they transform, as do all things. In tranquility, they share the inner power of yin. In activity, they surge together with yang. They will not initiate to gain advantage. They will not investigate to avoid difficulties. Only when stimulated do they respond. This idea of ganying, which was something that was really, really important, especially in the early Han. This idea of that spontaneous response we talked about, that not having all of the barriers that lead us to procrastinate or to overthink a problem, but being able to instantly and intuitively respond to a problem as it arises, to mirror a situation perfectly without any sort of obscurity or blemish on the surface of the mirror. Only when pressed do they move, only when it is unavoidable will they arise. They discard wisdom and precedent. They comply with the patterns of heaven. This is sort of that resultant trait that someone gets in this reading from these apophatic practices. In other words, by emptying out, as we were saying, you get rid of those anxieties and those constant categorizations and conditioning that prevent that responsiveness, that more natural response to something, and that allows for this kind of spontaneity. This is the kind of thing that you think about like an athlete or a musician, somebody who's engaged very deeply in some kind of skill-based activity, which skill-based activities are kind of one of the things that the Zhuangzi sort of emphasizes as being the highest form of knowledge. When someone has really deeply engaged in that kind of activity, when a new situation arises, right? You're playing tennis. You don't sit and watch the ball coming toward you and start analyzing, okay, now I should run over here and I should hold the racket at just exactly this angle. And if I do that, then it will have the force to be able to bounce it back, et cetera, because if you're doing too much of that, obviously you're slowed down. You can't respond quickly, right? We do it intuitively. We do it naturally. And that is kind of what's being captured here. And that's something that comes about from this kind of emptying out. And so this is kind of trying to trace this course of what's going on as we follow this. So I'm going to just finish up, and then I'll already getting some questions coming in. I'm just going to quickly wrap up my slides before getting to those. I'm going to start with saying that Roth's model isn't without its critics, and I think this is important. It's also, he really developed this about 20 years ago, and so we're still kind of working on developing it. But unfortunately, over the course of those 20 years, even though there have been people who have critiqued it, very few of them have actually engaged with his discussion of the contemplative practices themselves. Most of the criticisms of his work have been those kind of historical and textual considerations that I brought up earlier in this talk. Very few people have gone in and actually said, well, what's actually going on in these texts, or trying to analyze. There are a couple people, but it's not been something that a lot of people have engaged with. The biggest critique of his work has been this issue of the Huang Lao problem. So originally he talked about the Huainanzi as being in that category of Huang Lao Daoism that we mentioned. And he originally talked about classical Daoism in his earlier works as being Huang Lao Daoism, that idea that it was sometimes also what he calls syncretic Daoism, meaning that it brought together different aspects of different traditions. And this is in fact in the definitions of the 6 schools that Sima Tan wrote. He says, this is that Han Dynasty historian, he actually says that the Dao Jia brings together the best of all of the different available traditions and takes the best parts, gets rid of the parts that don't work, and combines them to make this kind of ultimate version of a philosophy or a way of ruling, which again, in Roth's model is based in this practice. So originally he called it Huang Lao, but as I mentioned, there's been a lot of critiques about what it really means to talk about Huang Lao. It was something that appears in the Shiji. We're a little bit more clear about how Lao Tzu was involved, because there's some historical evidence of how the text of the Lao Tzu that seems to have really kind of come together in this early period of the Han how it seems to have been involved in Han Dynasty politics. This was something I talk about in my dissertation and some of my other writing. But it's not really clear how Huangdi was involved in these. I have some ideas, but there's still a lot of that is uncertain. Some of that problem is that we're really uncertain if we even have the Huangdi text, the Yellow Emperor text, if the things we thought were the Yellow Emperor text are actually the Yellow Emperor text at all. And the other problem is, I mentioned this too, that Huang Lao was given too broad of an application in the minds of some scholars. In the official biography of Han Feizi, for example, it actually says he was Huang Lao. Han Feizi, who is usually thought to be one of the architects of legalism. And so even though he was not actually working for the Emperor of Qin, it was his classmate Li Se who worked for the Emperor of Qin. Han Feizi was involved in the text that's given his name that characterizes these rewards and punishments as being the foundation of society. It's like, well, should he be considered Huang Lao? And then also, some people have also said maybe even Shunzi, who's this somewhat famous Confucian figure, very important from the end of the Warring States period, who is the teacher of Han Feizi and Li Se. Maybe he should be considered Huang Lao too. And so in the minds of some scholars, that's casting the net too broadly. And what does the term even mean if you're starting to categorize all these people? Again, I think there's some productive work that can be done on this. I don't think that the book is closed on this, but let's just say for the time being that all of these questions and debates are things that have not yet been answered and that need to be clarified. But the advantages of Roth's model, which I brought up a little bit, are that by looking at affiliation based on shared practice rather than on using abstract ideas or text to define traditions, it reveals connections with later Daoist practices. As I mentioned, Dr. Kamiathi has done a lot of work on this, looking at how apophatic practice is something that actually you see as a thread that goes all the way from this classical period up to the present day. And you can see it again and again coming up as this theme, as this thing that links together all of these different aspects of the Daoist tradition. It also moves away from kind of the obsession with text-based, exclusively philosophical Daoism, the thing that actually people like Michel Strickland were criticizing. There was this obsession with a pure form of intellectual philosophical Daoism that was tainted by so-called superstitions. By looking at the practices, we can see that, again, there's actually these connections to it, and actually looking at some other kind of origin for these so-called philosophical ideas that's coming from some kind of direct experience, some personal experience. And as this final part, it opens this emphasis on human experiences and opens the door for what we call, and this is Professor Roth later, his real contribution after doing this work. He's worked extensively on developing contemplative studies. He's sort of the visionary who has developed this field of contemplative studies in which I'm now teaching, in which also, again, mentioning Dr. Kamiathi, has written a textbook and an anthology, edited an anthology for us, so is another expert on that as part of just this series, this workshop. But the idea of contemplative studies is that it combines what we call third-person traditional types of research and reading, things like reading books or attending classes like we're doing right now, having somebody tell you about something from this outside perspective, with critical first-person or subjective experience of actually going in and doing something like this apophatic practice and actually experiencing these states that are described in the text and seeing some of the resultant traits, and then being able to talk critically and analytically about those and combining them with the larger cultural framework from which they emerged, and also the potential it has for adding to human flourishing, including interdisciplinary research that includes scientific and social scientific research on these different topics. So all of this are doors that his work has opened up, which is why I think it is still really relevant and still extremely important, and why, quite frankly, more people need to engage with the practice side of it and not just the textual side of it. So in conclusion, to sum up everything we've talked about, these apophatic practices that begin with alignment lead to tranquility, that facilitate the concentration of qi, jing, shen, these other correlates of the mind, were these things, this practice was a central theme in certain texts that were associated with classical Daoism. The goals of these texts were multivalent. Some were medical, some were political, some were interested in kind of a transcendent merging with the Tao. So it's something that seems to cross these different purposes and these different definitions. It also crosses traditional school affiliations. So we talked about something like Neye appears in the Guanzi, which wasn't originally considered to be a Daoist text. But here we see, by looking at it from this practice perspective, we're able to see that it actually connects to this other kind of arc. So Roth's observation of the practice lineages reveal these connections. And really, I think if we look at all of these scholarly debates and critiques, a lot of the problem is just what we call it, right? There's a lot of hesitancy about saying, oh, this is Taoism, because saying something is Taoist, ironically, because Taoism is all about, not naming things, saying something is Taoist ends up meaning something, right? And so these are the practices and the theory that surround them that later impact everything Taoism, right? But also things that maybe some of us are familiar with from things like Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong, other kinds of Neijia Chuan, internal martial arts practices, also medicine, all kinds of things, right? It has these echoes throughout Chinese culture. So I'm going to end the slides here. Of course, if there's something you want me to go back to in the readings, we can always go back to that. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the questions. We're getting some really, really interesting discussions here. So I'll start with John Marshall had this question about this idea of conflict between the apophatic practice and visualization, right? Because when you're doing something in an apophatic practice, you're clearing out the house, right? So how do you then visualize the presence of a God in it? Or you also see landscapes visualized in some later Taoist practices as well. And it also brings in this later, even deeper issue of how do you combine Youwei, the sort of almost intentional aspects of practice, with Wuwei, the spontaneous or more natural aspects of practice. This seems to be, well, the problem here is that I think that some of the field posts shift over time. So we can't, if we're talking about something that's going on in the Song or the Tang dynasties or modern practice, it's going to be different than what people were doing in these earliest stages. From what we can tell, so the earliest stages don't talk very much about visualization practice beyond this kind of emptying out aspect. Later on, traditions oftentimes frame the visualization within a larger apophatic system, right? Almost as though you need to begin with cleaning out the house to let the spirits come in, and then you need to also go into the void, to return to the void, to have that kind of merging with the Tao, which itself is also thought to be empty. I do think it's interesting, this metaphor comes up again and again within the texts, that the human body is this lodging place. There's another passage in Neya that says that when jing lodges in the chest of a human being, when that vital essence lodges in the chest of a human being, they become a sage. When it concentrates outside the human, it creates a shen, a spirit. There's definitely this idea that somehow the vessel is also shaping the concentration of the stuff that goes on in it. And the capacity of that vessel in part is determined by the level of emptiness in it, if that makes sense. So I don't want to speak too much for the later traditions, because I think there's so much to them that they each have their own approach, and really every text, if we look at something like the Lao Tzu Zhongjing or the Huangdi Neijing that really talk about the body gods, they're looking at it from their own perspective that's going to be different from these classical texts, which are earlier. And I think that really deserves its own conversation. It is interesting, though, because even in this early period, we have this question about, and this has been a critique that's been raised. Interestingly, some people like Thomas Michaels has brought up that there's even maybe some distinctions between the contemplative practice in Zhuangzi, which is things like Zuo Wang or Xinjai, the sitting and forgetting or fasting of the mind, which seem to be a complete emptying out, versus something in Neya that has to do with dealing with almost kind of medical or Yangsheng practices. There's some issue. I don't want to get too much into talking about his work at this point, but it's one of the places where I've seen some interesting interaction with Roth's actual definitions of practice, of actually trying to talk about them in a way that deals with the practice itself rather than just the textual stuff surrounding it. And so I think that there is this question about how emptying is it, and how spontaneous is this process? Is one doing this to create a state, or is it something that is naturally and spontaneously happening? Roth's reading of it is that it's very much what he would call a discovery model versus a development model. So in religious studies, there's within these traditions, the idea of a development model is that you're building up, you are working towards some specific goal, that human beings don't inherently have something but have to work towards something. Whereas a discovery model is we have something naturally and spontaneously, and we have to peel back the layers of things that prevent us from seeing that stuff that is inherent in us. So Roth really sees this as being more of a discovery model, that by quieting down that idea of the murkiness settling down, we're revealing the natural clarity. And I kind of generally agree with this. Again, later on in the Taoist tradition, we see practices that are very much about kind of staging and building towards something. And so even though we see staging and building here, it's not, all of the sequence is about, okay, it's like setting that bottle on the ground, and the recommendation is just put the bottle of water on the ground and let it settle. It's not, do all this stuff to the water. It's not going through, as we'd see, like a full alchemical transformation process. So I don't think that I think the Yo Wei Wu Wei kind of practice thing it's not yet fully developed in these texts, although maybe there's some evidence of it. So next, also, Adam Rudolph, you had another great question about this idea of skill practices and how they were used in the past. You bring up guqin, calligraphy, painting, qigong. In the earliest texts that talk about it, so in Zhuangzi that talks the most about this, the examples are things like the classic one is actually the butcher, Cook Ding, who is so skilled at butchering oxen that, as he says, it's actually become a chengyu in modern Chinese, this set phrase of yoren you, that you have like a swimming blade that enters through something as though there's no obstruction to it, that you do something so well, it seems almost as if you can just do it perfectly and spontaneously, right? And actually describes him while he's cutting these oxen almost as if he's dancing. So it's this kind of spontaneous process. Some of the other people, there's a wheelwright who's able to carve wheels and is able to do it so well that it impresses this ruler, who asks him how he does it. But he says, I can't actually tell you. You have to do it. He says, I can't teach my son how to do this. Basically, his son has to do it on his own and has to discover it. It's something that's acquired through extensive learning, but then it becomes this impressive, spontaneous thing. There's also a swimmer who's able to go swimming in and out of eddies in a pool, and a cicada catcher who's able to catch these bugs with just very, very gently catching them on the end of a sticky stick. So all of these are highly skilled behaviors, and this becomes, of course, a theme that we see later on in Chinese culture. So you'll see it a lot in people doing music and art and martial arts and everywhere, that, this is this ideal, right? If you practice something so much, you can kind of attain this high level state. It's also importantly something that we see in Confucian thinking. Actually, in the Analects of Confucius, there's a little kind of thought to be a biography or autobiography of Confucius, where it says at 70, he could he could act as his heart desired without transgressing the boundaries of what he thought was proper. In other words, that he had cultivated himself so well in ritual performance that he could just interact with people spontaneously and without any kind of anything that would potentially prevent him from being able to act properly. Another Confucian text, the Zhongyong, sometimes translated as the Doctrine of the Mean, talks about how the cultivated Confucian person, the exemplary person, behaves exactly the same when they're alone as they do when other people are watching. That they've trained themselves, so even though these things seem like they're social values, they're actually so inherent, they're so skill-based that they're just performing them naturally. So in some ways, this is kind of a developmental thing, but we could say in the Zhuangzi, it's revealing something that is a natural spontaneity that's coming out through the skill-based practice. So yeah, that applies, and I think it's something, both of those elements we see coming up again and again in a lot of traditional Chinese culture. It's the sort of thing, if you do practice martial arts, you hear that idea, you repeat this movement over and over and over again until you don't even need to think about it. So if you need to use it, hopefully you never will, but if you need to use this to defend yourself, right, then all of a sudden it's something that happens spontaneously. Or I had, when I was in high school, I was impressed. I studied for a while with a Chinese painter. And there was a big gallery exhibition she was part of this art community, and all the teachers would participate in this exhibit at the end. Of course, all the other traditional Western style painters and sculptors and artists had their work up as something that was already fixed on the wall. And she was the only one who brought a table to this gallery event. And she had pieces of paper there, and she was actually doing the paintings spontaneously in the moment as she was doing them. And as she trained me, you do the strokes over and over again. You learn the basic pieces and you practice them until they become a part of you. And then by becoming a part of you, they allow for a natural expression. They give you a new way of being able to bring out something that is inherent and spontaneous in yourself that can then manifest on the page. right there in the moment. So I've always thought that's I mean, literally an illustration of that characteristic. So I hope that's answering some of it. So also, let me look. So Josh Painter, you asked, can I comment on the intersections in terms of soteriology, ontological, somatic, and moral cultivation? Easy question, right? Is there a unified field in which these converge, like Yuan Qi? And is there evidence in these earliest texts of multi-dimensional nature of cultivation that we see in later lineages, right? In terms of the ethical and so forth. Now, this is, of course, yesterday we were talking a lot about the importance of scripture and precepts on ethical behavior, on the development of practice, right? That you can't just do the practice and expect to get results in the absence of this ethical framework. Now, there is some evidence of ethical practice in these early texts. I think actually Dr. Kamiathi was talking yesterday about how the 9 practices really have their roots in the Daode Jing. And there are certain other kind of ethical aspects we can see even in the Zhuangzi of outlook on the world. But I also, so one of the things I think is that we don't see the kind of explicit description of ritual practice or ritualized behavior or moral precepts in this early period, because these texts and these ideas and these lineages were taking place in the larger context of an already really well-defined and established ritual tradition going back to the Joe Dynasty. And in fact, the Confucians are the ones who are saying at this time, we need to hold to that tradition. The Daoist texts are kind of looking at other ways of relating to that tradition. So when we see in the Lao Tzu, for example, there's a lot of critique of Confucian values. The critique isn't necessarily that, oh, we shouldn't be completely amoral, but it's rather that these have become, by this point in time, overly ritualized, right? That the connection to, and again, this is very contextually located, that the Zhou tradition has already been going on for 1,000 years, and people are almost just going through the motions, right? What Sandra was talking about with the critiques of the problems of some people when they're reciting the liturgy, if they just do it in an empty way, if they're just saying the words without actually having the meaning. Confucius was criticizing people of doing the same thing with the Zhou rituals. And I think that some of that critique in the classical Daoist texts is something similar, right? People are talking about, oh, be righteous, have Ren, have this humaneness, but they're using them in these very abstract ways without actually feeling them, without having that natural connection, human connection to them. So it's taking place within this larger context. And in that sense, rather than, later Taoism has a much more clearly defined ritual tradition of its own, which is kind of a response to the imperial, kind of solidification of ritual and calcification of ritual that happens in the Han Dynasty. And that brings in a lot of popular practice as well. And of course, at this time, we don't really know very much about popular practice because that's the kind of stuff that doesn't survive over 2,000 years. Those people, the people living in the village and doing a local practice were not necessarily literate and able to convey things. So we don't have journals and things and those kinds of lived evidence. So, but I really see it as this response to that larger existing ritual framework. I do think that there is a way in which, and this is again something that I'm working on in my own research, looking at how some of these psychophysiological elements like Yuan Qi, about Qi, Jing, Shen, and so forth, bring together a way in which stuff like dietetics, which does feature in Neya, as well as different health-oriented practices, things that we see in something like the Huangdi Neijing, a medical text, which also brings up some of these things. And there's also some medical aspects, even in the Huainanzi, that are related to health and human well-being. I do think that they all converge together. And I do think, even though it's not as clear as in later literature, I do think that already at this time, there was some conceptualization of that they kind of converge together. And a lot of the issue is picking out when it happens, right? There's some interesting work on this. People like, for example, a historian of Chinese medicine, Paul Inschold, has made some interesting analysis where there's actually the Han Dynasty, the 5 phases and so forth, types of medical analysis really becomes more prominent then as a response to what might have been earlier kind of spirit-based, more exorcistic meditation, shamanistic meditation, medical practice, sorry. And so that, there's a lot of debates going on about that. And again, because we have so little evidence from this time period, we're really we have to grasp at straws and like look at particular lines and figure out what people were doing, and then wait until something's dug up out of a tomb or something like that. And then everybody scrambles as soon as we get something like that and say, what does this mean? And usually we have more questions than answers. So it's tough to say, but I do think there was a lot of that at this time. Hope that answers your question. So Michael Begnall it mentions the Wenza and the Lietza. Great. Another easy question, right? And their tenuousness within the canons, right? They both seem to be derivative of other earlier texts, right? Is there any value to them, right? And also, does Roth intend to publish the translation of Xinshu, Shang, and Xia? Let me begin with that by saying, every so often he says yes, he's going to do it, and he keeps talking about it as another project, but he keeps ending up doing something else. So I hope someday he will do it, but I don't know when that's going to happen. I'll keep on him until he does that. You know, even if he just publishes the translations without all the apparatus, he likes everything to be really very, very scholarly, and you know, have lots of stuff attached to it that really defines it and talks about how it's situated, and that slows him down a lot. So maybe I can talk him into just publishing the translation somewhere. But in terms of the Wenza and the Liedza, yes, they are very problematic. So for example, Paul Van Els did a lot of research on the Wenza, published a book on this, his dissertation, then a book on the Wenza, and then Angus Graham earlier did a lot of work on the Liedza. Now with the Wenza, some computer analysis that looks at parallel passages, right? You can see if there's a lot of similarities in phrases now with computers, it makes this kind of thing a lot easier. Suggests that something close to 80% of the Wenza and the Huainanza are overlapping. And this has led to lots of people debating about which one comes first. There's some, if you believe the traditional model, supposedly the Wenza is earlier because Wenza was supposed to be somebody who was again a disciple of Lao-Tzu, who was supposed to be a historical figure. And so that would have made him predate the Huainanza. There's a lot of debate about, you know, now that we don't think that Lao-Tzu, or a lot of scholars don't think that Lao-Tzu was a particular person, or that at least that story that he you know, wrote down the entire text at one time. There's one person who wrote down the whole text and transmitted it that way, that probably isn't the way it happened. That's also called into question some of these other traditional narratives. The Wenzas, you know, that going back, you know, again, there were a lot of even Qing Dynasty scholars and earlier who were looking at this and saying, look, this is probably a forged text from maybe even the 3rd century of the Common Era. But we do have an excavated Wenza, which contains one chapter, I believe the 5th chapter of the Wenza, that looks really similar to the received Wenza 5th chapter, except with some major changes, which I don't have time to get into, but that's probably another topic. And that's reopened another can of worms if people say, oh, maybe it actually did. Yeah, read Paul Van Els' book if you're really interested in this, because he talks about it a lot. The Liedza also contains some similar issues. There's been a resurgence of work on that. In fact, where is it? This is, if you're really interested in that, what I'll recommend, this is the great thing about being at home in the library, Angus Graham's book, I don't know if you can see this, this is his translation. This is the only really good translation in English of the Liedza. It's old, but it's still there. And he also has an article on the dating of it, where he uses an old romanization system that has, I think, 2 or 3 Ys at the end of Liedza, so it looks really funny. But he talks a lot about this problem of dating it, and that it also probably was likely compiled at a similar time, brought together from different pieces. Interestingly, he thinks that one possibility is that it might contain pieces of the missing chapters of the 52 chapter version of Zhuangzi, that again, Huaxiang around the same time was revising and recompiling, that he redacted into the 33 chapter version that we have now. So that's something that Graham talks about. There's a lot of overlapping passages with Zhuangzi that appear in the Liedza if you're interested in that. And most recently, Ronnie Littlejohn and Jeffrey Dipman edited this volume that actually contains a lot of very recent scholarship within the last 10 years on Liedza. So I'd recommend looking at that too. They're problematic. I think they're even though we really shouldn't look at them as exclusively classical texts, because however much of that, of some sort of classical writing they preserve, they really were substantially modified in these later periods, redacted, and it's unclear exactly how much. they do still represent some vision of this period, and so I do think they've been kind of unfairly sidelined, and there hasn't been a lot of research done on them because they're considered to be Weishu, and so that's really another area that people could look into researching. That would be very, very productive, and they're interesting. They're actually great to read. As far as the Wenzi goes, Thomas Cleary, I believe, is the only person who's done a complete translation. May rest in peace. Unfortunately, passed away just last month. But that's the only translation that I know of that's a complete one of the Wenzi, unless I think Paul Van Els was thinking about doing something. I don't know if that's out. So that's related to those two. And yeah, also do look at, with Louis Kamiathi, Dr. Kamiathi posted in the chat, a very interesting work on Michael Sasso's ethnographic field work that was talking about the use of the Zhuangzi literature in Zhengyi liturgy. So Michael Sasso, who we talked about already, actually did a lot of interviews with, again, the library. I know Sander put this up in his talk, but the teachings of Daoist Master Zhuang, and this is not Zhuangzi, but this is the 20th century Master Zhuang who Michael Sasso studied with, who is his teacher, and has some interesting things. Sasso's also written there's some other articles that appear in other places on this topic as well, including reading very interestingly. There's a chapter in Zhuangzi, the second chapter, which is usually understood as being the title being Qi Wu Lun, which Angus Graham translates as the sorting which evens things out, or the discourse on the evening out of things, the equality of things. But this Master Zhuang understood it that there was an esoteric reading of that character Qi, where it looks like this other character Jai, which means fasting, of Xin Jai, the fasting of the mind. So he read it as the contemplative practice, sort of a discourse on fasting from things, fasting away from things, emptying out the mind. So that's something I'd also recommend taking a look at if you can get that. A very interesting writing. So yeah, I'm at the end of the chat questions. I don't know if anyone has anything else you'd like to bring up. I'd be happy if you want to raise hands or post something else. Otherwise, oh yeah, Jamie.
Larson, hi. This is a question very much from a novice practitioner. I apologize, and it's really not necessarily just to you, although I'd be very glad to hear your thoughts on it. But this is an aspect. It's really, I think, about Wu Wei, and how it's sort of in such conflict with a Western cultural sensibility. This idea that you're just sort of waiting to react to something, and that if without stimulus, you are sort of adrift. Westerners sort of naturally want to, they're, individualistic, and they sort of can't let go of, speaking for myself too, I struggle to let go of the idea that something has to motivate you. You have to be, even for good things like, say, social justice or something, the idea that I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you're trying to live by Taoist principles and you find yourself sitting alone on a mountain, do you then worry that you're missing something, that you have now disengaged from the world? Or how do you bridge that gap when some part of you can't let go of needing to have some reason to do something, and you've spent your whole life up to that point, having that reason be this illusion of, the story you tell yourself, and now there's nothing left. And what do you do when you find yourself alone on a mountain, or do you do anything?
This is a difficult question. These are all difficult questions, but this is difficult, I think, in a different way than the scholarly analysis. I think we have to keep in mind that mountains can be literal, like you can actually go sit on a mountain, but there's also a metaphorical way in which we can sit on a mountain or even be a mountain. A lot of the later illustrations in Daoism are of the body as a mountain, and recognizing that we have that as something that we already are, and we can discover how to manifest that as part of our experience. And also this question even of being alone. There's an interesting chapter 23 of the Zhuangzi has entitled Gengcangchu, has this very interesting moment where there's this old man who encounters a teacher, and he is so inspired that that teacher then sends the old man to his own teacher, who's Laozi in the story. And when the old man gets there and encounters Laozi, Laozi looks at him and says, he goes there alone, right? He goes to Laozi's house. He's by himself. He's traveling. He gets there. He shows up at the doorstep. And Laozi looks at him and says, "Why did you come here with such a crowd following you?" And the guy kind of looks around like, "What do you mean a crowd?" And of course, what he's talking about is all of the different things that people have put on him throughout his entire life, telling him who he is and how he should behave and what he should think about. He's carrying that with him all the time. Like they're all literally sitting there talking at him, right? Is the way he's conceptualizing it. So the first thing he has to do is clear all that out. And he has to actually spend days kind of fasting away from that to be able to emptying out, to be able to get to the point where he can start to, quiet down all that noise to listen to what's actually there underneath, right? So that becomes sort of the first stage. So are we ever alone, right? And I think a lot of times when people have a feeling of being alone, it's not really being alone, right? So there's that question of it's an aloneness where we want to be with other people because we remember what that is, and that's an aloneness where we're conceptually separating, right? And that's what he thinks he's alone when he's going in, but it's not actually reaching that point. And as far as the Wu Wei concept goes, I think it comes along with one of the things that these early texts seem to suggest is that when you empty out, then you give room for something else to fill in, right? That something else is able to come into that space. So Wu Wei is defined in a lot of places. Actually, if you're interested, I have a colleague, Adrian Stoloff, who did his dissertation on this and actually has a TED talk up on the internet where he talks about some modern interpretations of Wu Wei from the perspective of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's flow, which is a positive psychology, which is this idea that it goes back to that skill-based learning. Actually, to Adam's question about this idea of writing poetry and skill-based stuff. This notion of flow is that when you're in a state, when you're so engaged with something, it feels like you've lost a sense of self because you're so connected to it. You forget about time, you forget about everything else that's going on, you forget about who you are, and you just become whatever task you're doing. And so there's this way of reading Wu Wei now that is as not non-action, but effortless action, that it really is engaging in this way. There are other texts early on which are more politicized, things like the Han Feizi, which want to read Wu Wei in a different sense, which is about actually, you figure everything out, you anticipate things ahead of time, and so you take care of problems before they become too big. And so in that way, it feels like you're never doing anything. This is like the stories of the three doctors, right? The most famous one is the one who corrects things when they've become a problem because you already see it's a problem. But the best one of the three is the one who anticipates diseases before they even happen. And so nobody ever gets sick while he's ministering to them. This seems to be an early interpretation of Wu Wei as well. But I also think that there's there's other ways of reading Wu Wei where it becomes, how to put it, I don't want to say maybe mystical, although I hesitate to use that term because I think it's got a lot of baggage attached to it, where you are kind of connecting with that rhythm of everything, right? And by, again, getting rid of the stuff that usually tells us this is who I am and this is what I need to do, it gives that space for something that is more fundamental to manifest. And that's scary. I think there's a tendency for people raised in the West to think, we're influenced by Freudian psychology and this idea that underneath everything is the id, which is this nasty thing which is going to come up. And if you let go of everything, suddenly you're going to become this horrible person. But these texts seem to suggest there's something more fundamental, and that the way to access it is through kind of letting go and becoming immersed in something. And that's why there's so many different ways of cultivating, I think. Again, this point of, the skill-based practices is another way of doing it. So it's not just sitting still, but you can empty out by engaging in a task very deeply. And that's why I think we do see sometimes people using that as a form of practice or a mode of practice, either supplementally or it's a core.
Yeah, and another part of what you just said that I would comment on is that in addition to this fear of the id, that you might do something bad, I think for Westerners, there's also a fear of of just not knowing why you would do anything, of just that emptiness of like just letting go and not needing to know why you might do something or what might happen, or just being.
Yeah, I think, well, this I think is one of the most wonderful things about Taoism in general, is this valuing emptiness and this idea of xuan, the profound, the mysterious, something that is not known and might even be unknowable. And whereas usually we're afraid of that, Taoism as a whole seems to embrace it and say, you don't know it? That's great. You know, that means if you don't know it, there's potential, right? If you know everything in some way, it's limiting that. And that it's the unknowable, the unknown and the unknowable, that gives room for transformation, and that embraces that. And that's something that is in these classical texts. It's in, I think, built into the apathetic practice, and you see it coming up again and again. And it's something that, yeah, maybe some of us need in our lives. So, but I am aware we've gone on over time, as is our want in this conference. So I don't know. I imagine people probably have things to go to, and will want to get ready for the afternoon as well. So
anyone that wants to leave is welcome to, and anyone who wishes to stay is also welcome to. Shifu, did you have anything you wanted to say? I see you're unmuted.
Actually, not. It's good. Everything good. Maybe ask someone have a question or not.
Okay. And would anyone else like to ask Larson or any of the speakers who are still here a question? Okay. Well, I guess we can conclude for now, and we will see you all back for Master Joe's talk at 2 o'clock this afternoon.
okay.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Larson.
All right. Take care, everyone.